Hello. I've set up a discussion board on Blackboard. So you can go to Blackboard, go to my course, go to the discussion board, and I set up a forum for comments on my last class on sex rules. Add some comments to it. And I'll set up another forum on the judiciary when I'm done making this tape, so you can also comment there. I will try to put up a video on YouTube for each class, and I'll send you the link. I want to thank Matt for suggesting that. For my first class, I made a video and I emailed it to everybody, and Blackboard went bananas. It can't handle such a large file. It was Matt that suggested put it up to YouTube and give us the link, and that seems to be working. If you have individual books under our topic today, the judiciary, what you should do is email me a one-page synopsis critique of your book, and I'll pass it around to people in the class. Everybody knows on the last class you have to give me a 5-page critique of your book, but that's the last class. For these individual topics, when we get to individual books, a one-page synopsis will suffice. That's more or less like writing in Washington. In the university, we have page after page of papers that we write, but in Washington and offices, people want an executive summary. They want things short and sweet. That's what your one-page critique should do. Now, our topic for today is the judiciary. And I put it on the syllabus right after the culture wars because the judiciary decides many issues like the cultural war issues for us. So, for instance, hot-button issues like partial birth abortion, teenagers having abortion without parental consent, all kinds of issues like that. Where should the Ten Commandments be allowed to be placed? What is acceptable in publication in terms of pornography and child pornography? These are the kinds of issues that are decided by the Supreme Court, and I find people are very emotional about these sorts of things, so the courts are important. It was Jefferson himself that thought that one of the greatest defects to the republic we set up at the Constitutional Convention was the lifetime tenure of judges. And he had said on occasion that if he could make one change to the Constitution, it would be on that one. Jefferson had probably the most negative view of the founders of the judiciary. Contrast that with in the 20th century President Taft, who thought judges were like angels. He was a president and a member of the Supreme Court, and he enjoyed being a member of the Supreme Court more than being president. It was Taft who was influential in saying the court should be elevated to equal status with the president and with Congress. And symbolically, it was Taft that had the great temple that the Supreme Court meets in now across from the Capitol building, built in the 1930s. If you've ever been through the U.S. Capitol, you can see the old Supreme Courthouse, the chamber. It's dark and it's dingy. This is for a minor part of government, not for a major part of government. So symbolically, our nice building for the Supreme Court represents Taft's idea. Now, going back to the founding, we can see that we know from the Federalist Papers Alexander Hamilton's idea on the judges and what the judges will be like. And people thought, well, Jefferson wasn't there, but it was people that thought like Jefferson that thought, are we going to really have a major branch of government in which people are not elected and serve for life? Isn't that a threat to our liberty? It was Hamilton that characterized what the dominant view was on the judges at the time. And I'm quoting him from Federalist Paper number 78 here. And Hamilton says, whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary from the nature of its functions will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. Least dangerous, according to Hamilton, because the judiciary will be has the least capacity to annoy or injure the people. The executive not only dispenses the honors, but holds the sword of the community. That is commander-in-chief. That's a threat. The legislature not only commands the purse, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen ought to be regulated. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence of either the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of the society, and can take no active resolutions whatever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. Uh, that is how Hamilton came to the idea that the judiciary was the least dangerous branch of government. Now, there are other people at the times at the debate after the Constitutional Convention that argue that, in fact, the judiciary is the most dangerous branch of government. That would be more or less the kind of ideas of Mr. Jefferson. Now, where does the judiciary get its power? I have my copy of the Constitution here. Where in here can I look to see what powers the judiciary has? And its great power, the power of the judiciary, is what we call judicial review. That is, that the court and the judges have the power to veto whatever the president and what the Congress does, claim they're unconstitutional and they're null and void. That's a tremendous power. And we look hard in the Constitution to find where it is, but you look in vain because it's not in the Constitution at all. Matter of fact, it comes from a kind of bootstrapping that the Supreme Court did under John Marshall, who was generally considered the greatest of the Supreme Court justices. If you go to the Supreme Court building, and I do a couple times a year, one of the things you notice is the prominence of John Marshall. They have a big statue of him. And in the room where the justices have it, they have a conference room where they decide who's going to write the majority opinion, who's going to write the minority opinion. They have hanging on the wall at the head of the table a big painting of John Marshall. So he's important. And it was John Marshall in the Supreme Court decision Marbury versus Madison in 1803, which argued in effect that it is the Supreme Court that has the right to say what the Constitution means. And it is the Supreme Court that has judicial review, that power to strike down what the president and what the legislature do. And it was in Marbury versus Madison that John Marshall said, quote, "A law repugnant to the Constitution is void," unquote. And then he went on to say it is the court's power to decide what the Constitution actually means. Now, I'm going to treat this idea of the role of the judges in American political thought as I have the other issues. I'm going to look at the political left. What does the political left think about it? And if I talk to people on the political left, what would I say that they would agree with? And then I'm going to talk about the political right. And here the political right has the conservatives and libertarians together. The libertarians sometimes move around on these different issues, but they seem to be with the conservatives on this idea of the role of the judges. Now, the left's view on judicial philosophy answers the question, what should a judge do? And it has to do with the dominant view on the left of what the Constitution is. The term living document is central to the left's idea of what the Constitution says. And the living Constitution view says that over time we progress in our values, hence part of progressivism, and that it's up to the judges to bring the Constitution up to date with our changes. That is, it's a living document. It's not set in stone, and we must not see it just as an 18th century document, and the judges have to bring it up to speed. So, for instance, we've changed a lot since the days of Hamilton. We don't settle our disputes by dueling. Maybe Hamilton would wish that he'd lived such an era. People raised eyebrows when Vice President Biden said if he were in high school, he'd take Trump behind the gym and beat the hell out of him. We don't act like that anymore. And this is considered moving forward. We don't flog people. We don't cut their hands off, things like that. So this idea that we have moral progress over time, and then that it's the role of the judges to bring the Constitution and bring the government up to what it's like at that time. Now, it would be the view that in fact that's what the judges do by making things better than they were before. I think you can get a good idea of the attitude of the living Constitution if I read you parts of a dedication to the living Constitution view by a Colbert King. He was an editorialist in the Washington Post for years, a man on the left. And he wrote a dedication really to the living Constitution view when Rosa Parks died, remember Rosa Parks had been that little lady that got the ball rolling in the civil rights movement when she refused to give up her seat on the bus because of her skin color. And after her death that week, Colbert King wrote in the Washington Post uh, this. So, on the occasion of Rosa Parks' death, I also pay tribute to activist judges, and he has activists in sneer quotes like this. Uh, Activist judges such as Warren, William O. Douglas, William Brennan, Thurgood Marshall, and others. They will always be among my heroes. And then Colbert King says, now I'll rest a second to allow my conservative colleagues to get a hold of themselves, because this is just heresy on the political right. Uh, then he goes on and he says, were it not for liberal activists, again quotes, liberal activist judges, how long would it have been before 1. Rosa Parks could have sat anywhere she wanted on a bus? 2. Miscegenation laws would have been invalidated. Miscegenation laws didn't allow people of different races to get married. The court struck that down. 3. Illegally obtained evidence would have been deemed inadmissible in court. It was the court that did that. 4. Citizens accused of a crime would have been provided a lawyer if they couldn't afford one. 5. Citizens would have to be informed of their rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to counsel before being questioned by police. 6. Public school boards would have been stopped from writing and adopting prayers for students to recite. Court struck down prayer in public schools in the 1950s. 7. All citizens would have been guaranteed a constitutional right to privacy, quote unquote. This idea of a right to privacy is central to things like abortion and same-sex marriage that were used to bring the Constitution up to date, according to people on the political left. Now, according to the theory of the living Constitution, as times change, we progress, and judges update the meaning of the Constitution. Something like this living Constitution view has, over the last 4 decades, become predominant in our law schools and among America's intelligentsia. And I trace it back to the early person that I see advocating it was President Wilson. President Wilson, our first big progressive president, had the idea that the old Constitution was based on a conceptualization of politics that would fit in with Isaac Newton's idea. That is, there is this balance and movement that takes place. It was Wilson's idea that science has been updated by Darwin, and Darwin had the idea of evolving and getting better over time. And the living Constitution idea fit in with that. So it was Wilson who was really the first president I know who was very critical of the original Constitution and its Madison interpretation. Now, that's on the political left. The political right disagrees with that. And instead of living Constitution, I think the concepts that are used on the political right are textualism and originalism. That is that when a judge looks at the Constitution, he has to construe it to mean what was the original meaning when the people who wrote it down. Textualism is the idea you look at the text and what is the meaning of the words, not what would I think is just or what would I do to bring it up to date, but you have to rely on the people that actually wrote it. I take the ideas of textualism and originalism and bundle it up into a really influential society on the political right called the Federalist Society. You can look up things about the Federalist Society, but basically it's been with us almost 40 years. It was founded by people on the political right who were alarmed by this living Constitution idea and that it became so widespread in American society. And so they founded an organization by people who disagreed with it to try to put people that think like them in the judiciary. Now, what the people on the political right from the Federalist Society believe is that this living Constitution idea is nothing but a method for people on the political left to read their personal politics into the Constitution. And that's really powerful to be able to do that. People at the Federalist Society believe that this is a serious violation of the separation of powers. The separation of powers has the idea that you have the president and you have the legislature and the courts, and the laws are to be made by the legislature, and then the president has some input with the veto into that, and that in fact people can control the president and the legislature when they don't like their laws through elections, and that it's not for the judges to make laws, and it's the charge from the Federalist Society that in fact when under the living Constitution, you have the unelected judges making laws in the United States, and thereby short-circuiting the input that people have into these laws. Uh, the political rights ideas started with the Federalist Society, but the real champion of that was a man named Robert Bork. I don't know if you know Robert Bork. He was a constitutional law professor at Yale. One of his classes he talks about was an interesting class in which he had Bill Clinton sitting over here and Hillary Rodham over here and then Robert Reich, three influential people who would disagree with Bork later in life. He says that looking at their ideas of the judiciary when they got into power, I don't think they learned anything in my class because he's the originalist. He he was nominated to be a member of the Supreme Court in the 1980s, and a firestorm broke out. I mean, think of the Kavanaugh hearing last year and what you experienced. That's how it was when Bork was nominated. It was a huge fight, one of the first big fights in the United States that really underlined how important getting people on the Supreme Court was. Matter of fact, Doug's rule number 33 is that if your name becomes an adjective or a verb, you've been influential. And you can look up the verb to bork as a verb. Has different meanings for people. When I ask people on the political left, what does to bork mean? They define it as to publicize the shortcomings of a right-wing judge so that they will be defeated and wouldn't be able to impose on us their vision. When I ask people on the political right what it means to bork, they believe it's the smearing of a conservative judge to prevent his elevation so that the left could dominate the judiciary and dominate us. So that the right-wing definition of to bork would apply to the Kavanaugh hearings. That's what they felt that this Kavanaugh hearing was. It was a throwback to Bork. We know Bork's ideas because he wrote an influential book on the political right, The Tempting of America, and it defends this originalist view, saying that under originalism, a judge has a duty to interpret the Constitution or the laws as they were commonly understood at the time, and not to read into the Constitution their own personal views. So the duty of the judges is not to hand out justice. When people hand out justice, it depends on their personal politics and their heart. The duty of judges is, here is the term, judicial restraint, meaning this is what the law thinks, this is what I think. I disagree with the law, but I rule according to what the law is. That would be the great virtue on the political right to judges. Now, what happened is that judges became more and more influential, so their elevation has become big fights in the United States. It used to be that passing the Senate, you had to have 60 votes because of the filibuster. Then the parties began to eat away at that. First, it was Senator Reid under the Democrats, which eased up that 60 vote necessary to elevate judges to the lower courts. And then it was Mitch McConnell who moved this up to the Supreme Court. So now you can put a person on the Supreme Court with 51. Or if you get 50 tie and you have a vice president of your party, they can break the tie. So now it's become very influential in the United States to have these big fights over the court, and they're so important. That means that you can see in the Kavanaugh hearings what a fight was like because the stakes are so high. Because of this importance of getting 5 votes on the Supreme Court, this is why when Judge Ruth Ginsburg sneezes, it's front page news in the newspapers. And if President Trump gets another nominee to the court, I expect it to be even more vicious than we had during the Kavanaugh times. Now, what you want to do is go to Blackboard and go under my course, and I've set up a forum in the discussion board, and you can go there and you can make comments on this topic. say how unprofessional it is, I can blame the unprofessionalism of this video on my technical staff, which consists of one person, me, and I don't have much experience about this. And people who have books of the judiciary, send me a one-page summary and critique of your books, and I'll send them out to people. Thank you and enjoy your time away.